Let me be straight with you right from the start. There are weekends in NASCAR that you remember not because of who won the championship, not because of a last lap crash that reshuffled the standings, and not because some veteran driver put together a perfect points day. You remember them because something happened that actually meant something, something that cut through the noise and reminded you why this sport gets under your skin and stays there. This was one of those weekends. What unfolded at Rockingham Speedway on this particular day was not a fairy tale. It was not a perfectly scripted comeback story, where everything lined up just right and a newcomer somehow defied all expectations with a miraculous result. It was messier than that, more honest than that, and honestly far more interesting because of it. What we witnessed was a single driver, at a single track, on a single day, going through what felt like an entire season's worth of emotional and competitive range compressed into just a few hours. 2 races, same venue, same driver, completely different stories. And the gap between those 2 stories is where all the real meaning lives. This is about Cleetus McFarland, and before anyone rolls their eyes or immediately categorizes this as a content creator doing a publicity stunt, I want you to pump the brakes on that instinct. Because what happened here deserves a more serious conversation than that framing allows. The results, the mistakes, the adjustments, the self-awareness, all of it points to something that goes beyond a personality trying racing for a weekend. This is a story about what it actually takes to develop as a driver inside one of the most demanding racing environments in the world, and it is a story worth telling properly. Rockingham Speedway is not a track that hides your weaknesses. It is not a place where you can coast along in the pack and avoid exposure. The layout demands commitment, demands that you trust your car, trust your setup, and most importantly, trust yourself under pressure. Drivers who are not fully comfortable with their own instincts get found out quickly there, and the track has a way of amplifying whatever mental state you bring onto it. For an experienced NASCAR driver, that is a challenge. For someone still working through the fundamentals of stock car racing at a competitive level, it is an entirely different kind of pressure, and that context is essential to understanding everything that happened on this day. Cleetus McFarland arrived at this track with real backing. Richard Childress Racing is not a casual operation. It is not a team that exists to give anyone a participation trophy. RCR has history, infrastructure, genuine technical expertise, and a culture of performance that has been built over decades. When a driver operates within that environment, there are real expectations attached, not necessarily about winning right away, but about learning correctly, behaving professionally, and showing that the investment of time and resources is justified. That context raises the stakes considerably because this was not a weekend where showing up was enough. This was a weekend where showing growth was the baseline requirement. The first race of the day was in the NASCAR series, and from qualifying onward, it was clear this was going to be a difficult afternoon. Starting from 33rd position means you are already operating in heavy traffic from the moment the green flag drops, and every lap in that part of the field is more complicated. There are more cars around you, more opportunities for contact, more moments where your decision-making is tested before you have even had a chance to settle into any kind of rhythm. The stated approach going in was sensible and measured. Take it easy, treat the race like a learning exercise, stay clean, build experience lap by lap, and let the understanding come organically rather than forcing anything. This is genuinely the correct philosophy for a driver at this stage of development. The problem with correct philosophies, of course, is that they are far easier to commit to before the race starts than after the green flag flies and adrenaline takes over. And that is precisely what happened. Early in the race, instead of executing the patient and disciplined approach that had been planned, the competitive instinct kicked in. A 3-wide situation into the corner, not the conservative line, not the careful positioning, but the aggressive play. Too much speed, too much commitment, not enough margin for error. The car got away, and the spin happened. Now, here is the thing about an early spin. It is not just a physical event, it is a mental one. When you make a mistake in the opening laps of a race, something changes in your head. You become hyper-aware of what just happened. You start processing the mistake instead of the next corner. You either overcorrect, which means you are too cautious and fall further behind, or you try to make up for it too quickly, which means you are still not respecting the limits that just bit you. Neither of those is the smooth, calm, controlled state you need to drive a stock car well. And so, the domino effect began. A second spin came later in the race, this one less about aggression and more about misjudging entry speed, carrying too much into the corner and running out of grip before reaching the exit. Pure and simple, this is what inexperience looks like when it surfaces. It is not a character flaw, it is a data point. The feedback from the car was not being read quickly enough, and the result was another loss of control. Then came a contact situation, and what is notable here is not just that the contact happened, but that he acknowledged partial responsibility for it. Not pointing fingers, not deflecting, just a clear-eyed assessment that he was part of the problem in that moment. Another incident followed, this time while trying to navigate around the leaders, and even the attempt to be careful resulted in trouble. That is a particularly frustrating type of problem to have, because it means the difficulty is not just about aggression, but about the entire skill of traffic management, which is one of the most nuanced things a NASCAR driver has to master. By the end of the day, 4 spins total, a final finishing position of 32nd, one place better than where the race started, and somewhere in the middle of all that, a spin on pit road which added an almost symbolic layer to how thoroughly the race had gone sideways. But here is what actually mattered most about race 1, and it is not any of those incidents individually. What mattered was the moment late in the race when the tires were completely worn down, the leaders were closing in fast, and the full weight of the situation became clear. He said directly that he felt completely in over his head, and that is not a comfortable thing to admit. That is not an easy thing to say publicly, but it is real, and it is the kind of honest self-assessment that actually creates the foundation for improvement. Because the drivers who struggle the most, long-term, are not the ones who make mistakes. Mistakes are universal, and they happen to everyone at every level. The drivers who struggle the most are the ones who cannot accurately diagnose what went wrong or who protect their ego by blaming external factors instead of looking inward. None of that happened here. The assessment was clear, specific, and personal. Mistakes were made, they were his mistakes, they cost him the race he wanted to have, and he understood exactly what they were. There was also something worth noting about how the race kept resetting emotionally, because multiple times during the event, he found a small pocket of rhythm, started feeling better, started running with a group and getting comfortable, started to understand the flow of what was happening around him, and then another mistake and back to square one. That cycle of confidence building and then suddenly crashing is one of the most psychologically taxing parts of learning to race at this level, and the fact that he kept finding his way back to something resembling composure instead of completely falling apart mentally is genuinely meaningful. And through all of it, one thing stood out above everything else. He did not take anyone else out. In 4 spins, in all that chaos, in all that loss of control, he kept other drivers out of his problems. That is not a small thing. In a garage full of professionals who have worked their whole careers to be there, showing that kind of situational awareness, even when you are struggling, earns a specific kind of quiet respect that does not always show up in any results column. Something had to shift between race 1 and race 2, not mechanically, not strategically in some grand sense, but mentally. Because the performance that came in the RCA race that same day at the same track was not the product of forgetting what happened earlier, it was the product of processing it. The RCA Menard Series race presented a different kind of opportunity. Running for Brett Jones Racing in the number 30 car, the circumstances were different enough to allow a fresh approach, but the track was the same. Rockingham, same asphalt, same corners, same demands on commitment and trust. And this time, everything looked different. A 4th place finish, top 5, not a podium, not a win, but a result that sits comfortably in the range where serious attention gets paid. And the way it was achieved matters just as much as the number itself. The description of this race from his own perspective was one of the most telling things about the entire day. He said it was the most confident he had ever felt inside a stock car, and that is a significant statement. Not the most successful, not the most perfect technically, but the most confident. And confidence in racing is not arrogance. It is not thinking you are better than everyone else. It is the feeling of operating within your own limits clearly and without anxiety. It is knowing where your edges are and working within them deliberately, rather than stumbling across them by accident. He kept the leaders in his sights throughout the race, and that is not easy. Keeping a gap from growing requires consistent lap times, consistent lines, consistent judgment about when to push and when to back off. Every lap where the gap stays manageable is a lap where the mental discipline held, and every corner where he managed his speed correctly was a corner where the lessons from earlier in the day were being applied in real time. He was not forcing moves. He was not manufacturing situations where risks did not need to be taken. He was reading the race as it developed and responding to what was actually in front of him rather than what he wanted to be in front of him. He managed the race instead of fighting it. That phrase is worth sitting with for a moment because it captures the central difference between a driver who is surviving a race and a driver who is actually competing in one. Surviving means you are always reacting, always a step behind, always dealing with the consequences of something that already went wrong. Competing means you are making choices ahead of time, positioning yourself deliberately, creating situations rather than responding to them. What he showed in race 2 was genuine early-stage competing, not at the level of a championship contender, not in a way that would send veterans reaching for their notebooks, but clearly and unmistakably different from what had come just hours before. Greg Biffle received specific credit for the improvement, and that is a name that deserves recognition in this context. Biffle is a NASCAR veteran with real race wins, real experience at the highest levels of the sport, and a deep understanding of what it takes to perform consistently. Having that kind of mentorship available, and more importantly being receptive to it and actually applying it under pressure, is a meaningful combination. Richard Childress Racing also received credit for the environment it created, and this matters because development does not happen in isolation. The fastest growth in any competitive skill comes from being surrounded by people who know more than you, who push you to think more carefully, and who create a culture where learning is treated as a serious ongoing process rather than something that happens passively. That is what RCR provided, and this result in part reflects that investment. The restraint shown after finishing 4th was, in its own way, just as impressive as the result itself. Rather than celebrating as if the arc of finish erased the earlier difficulties, he immediately acknowledged the next challenge still ahead, said plainly that he would probably struggle there, not with deflation, not with false modesty, but with the kind of clear-eyed awareness of where he actually stands that marks a driver who is genuinely serious about improving rather than just interested in the moments that feel good. There is something uniquely revealing about watching the same driver go through 2 completely different competitive experiences in such a short window of time. Normally, a bad race and a good race are separated by weeks. There is time to process, time to reset, time for the emotional weight of one to fade before the next arrives. Here, there was almost no gap. The reset had to happen quickly, and whatever adjustments were made had to stick immediately, or they would not stick at all. The fact that they stuck, that the lessons from race 1 were not just acknowledged intellectually, but actually translated into behavioral changes in race 2, is the most important finding of this entire day. Growth in racing is not linear. It does not follow a clean upward trajectory where each race is a little better than the one before. It is inconsistent, non-linear, and often frustrating. But when you see someone demonstrate the ability to adjust within such a compressed time frame, it tells you something about how they process information under stress, and that processing speed matters enormously for long-term development. The mistakes in race 1 were real. The improvement in race 2 was also real, and both things are true simultaneously, without either one canceling out the other. The chaos of the first race does not erase the top 5 of the second, and the top 5 of the second does not rewrite the first race into something it was not. What they do together is paint a more complete picture of where this driver is right now, and more importantly, where the trajectory is pointing. He is not finished developing, he is not ready to challenge for wins against established NASCAR talent on a consistent basis, but he is not stagnant either. He is not the same driver who showed up at Rockingham at the start of that day. Something shifted, something was learned and applied, and that is rarer and more valuable than it might sound. The mention of Talladega as the next event on the schedule adds an entirely different layer to this conversation, because Talladega Superspeedway is one of the most unique environments in all of motorsport, let alone NASCAR. It is a track where the traditional skill hierarchy gets reshuffled significantly. Experience matters, but not in the same way it does on a short track or a road course. Drafting knowledge matters, patience matters, the ability to stay calm in incredibly dense and incredibly fast traffic matters, and the instinct not to do something reckless when the pack is 3 and 4 wide at nearly 200 miles per hour matters enormously. Decision-making, that specific combination of quick thinking and emotional discipline, matters more at Talladega than almost anywhere else. What the Rockingham Day demonstrated is that he has the capacity for both the mistakes and the recovery. And the question at Talladega becomes which of those shows up and whether the environment of a superspeedway race is one where his instincts serve him or work against him. The honest answer is that nobody knows yet, and that is part of what makes it genuinely interesting. He has now shown that he can respond to adversity within a compressed time frame. He has shown that mentorship from someone like Biffle is translating into real on-track behavior, and he has shown that the RCR environment is accelerating his development in meaningful ways. Whether all of that is enough for Talladega, and what exactly happens there, is a question the track itself will answer. NASCAR has a long history of drivers who showed up with fanfare and faded quickly once the reality of the competition set in. It also has a history of drivers who struggled visibly early, were written off by plenty of observers, and then found their footing over time and built something real. The difference between those two paths is not always talent, at least not in the conventional sense. It is often the combination of the right environment, the right mentorship, the right attitude toward failure, and the willingness to keep showing up and keep adjusting, even when the adjustments are not yet producing the results you want. Every element of that combination was visible at Rockingham. The environment through RCR, the mentorship through Biffle, the attitude toward failure and how Race 1 was addressed, the willingness to keep going in the pivot to Race 2, and then the immediate look ahead to Talladega. None of that guarantees anything. Racing is unforgiving, and the competition level only gets more demanding as the stakes increase. But it does paint a picture of a driver who is approaching this with the seriousness that serious racing demands, and that is at minimum worth paying attention to. Perhaps the most underrated element of everything that happened on this day was the mental approach throughout, not just in the races themselves, but in how everything was discussed and framed afterward. There was no false bravado after Race 1, no attempt to reframe 4 incidents as bad luck or the fault of other drivers or the car not being right. Just a direct acknowledgement of what happened and why. There was also no excessive deflation, no dramatic declaration that NASCAR was too hard or that the expectations had become too much. The immediate response was to look forward rather than backward and to treat the bad race as data rather than identity. After Race 2, there was no overclaiming either. A top 5 finish in ARCA is a real result, but it was contextualized correctly because the harder race was still coming, the work was not done, and the improvement was real but not yet complete. That balance, honest about failures, encouraged by successes but not inflated by them, always oriented toward the next challenge, is not something that can be coached directly. It is a reflection of genuine mental makeup, and it is the kind of mental makeup that makes a driver coachable, which in turn makes everything else possible. The next few events will tell us a great deal more than this single day could, because patterns require multiple data points, and one bad race followed by one good race is interesting. But it is still just 2 points. More races will reveal whether the adjustment at Rockingham was the beginning of a sustained improvement, or whether there are still significant consistency challenges ahead. Talladega specifically will be a test of a completely different kind, because the skills that produced a 4th-place finish in ARCA at Rockingham are not the same skills that determine success at a superspeedway. The game changes entirely, new lessons will be required, new mistakes will probably happen, and how those mistakes are processed will again be the most revealing thing about where this driver's development is actually headed. But heading into that event, there is at least a different kind of story to tell than the one that existed before this weekend. The narrative is no longer just about whether someone can handle the challenge of real NASCAR competition. That question now has a more layered answer. Yes, the challenge is real, and yes, the gaps are real. But also, yes, the adjustments are happening, and yes, the potential is there, in ways that a 4th-place ARCA result at a legitimate venue backed by legitimate teams and mentored by legitimate veterans genuinely confirms. That combination makes this one of the more compelling developing stories in NASCAR right now. Not because the results are dominant, not because the talent level is already at championship caliber, but because the elements that drive long-term development, honesty, coachability, mental resilience, and the right surrounding environment, all appear to be present and functioning. And in a sport as demanding and competitive as NASCAR, that is actually where every meaningful career begins. 2 races, same track, same day. One told a story of the limits of where a driver currently stands, and the other told a story of where that driver could be heading. The distance between those two stories, and how quickly it gets closed, is the thing worth watching from here.